Okay, so now we're going to start with two new tests. I'll introduce one today and the second one next session. Still continuing with this idea of spacing and pushing the use of spacing to really think about weight. With this idea, we'll be doing a flour sack, a falling flour sack that just falls straight down, hits the ground, and a falling leaf that goes down slowly, right? So really dealing with the idea of heavy and light, with the thought that maybe the ball bounces we already have done now were like a middle weight thing. So we'll start with the flour sack. Like I said, the next session I'll introduce the leaf test. So what we're gonna have happen is now a flour sack, a heavy object's gonna fall and hit the ground. And really it's just a simple adjustment of your timing chart, right? Your use of spacing, that idea of the acceleration rate that's going to change. So first you're going to start with a flour sack hanging. And with this idea of weight, a few things are going to really play a part. They all have to come together to create a feeling of weight. That is obviously, like I already said, your spacing, your timing chart you're going to use, but also the drawings, right? So this first drawing is really key. And then it has to feel heavy. And then when it hits the ground, it's going to do, and this is a very important aspect to animation, one of the main principles of animation, it's going to do what's called follow through. And that's the simple idea of a heavy object can't just stop dead, right? There's going to be some aspect of follow through when the object tries to stop. And I'll talk about that in more detail shortly. So first, start by getting this really heavy flour sack. And you want to think in terms of a simple idea of construction for your flour sack. This will help you in drawing it from various angles. So when you first start thinking of it, if you look what I'm doing, I'm drawing a mass, essentially what looks like a stretched ball, right? And then from that, pulling these straight lines up. This is really the kind of functional shape of the flour sack. We'll add a few more details so it looks more like a actual flour sack as opposed to I guess a teardrop or whatever you want to call this. But this is really the thing we're going to be animating on the way down. Such a key aspect of animation is understanding things as forms, as objects, so that you can turn them in space. And that's what we're doing. So right now it might not be obvious that it's important, but especially when you get down to the follow through the bottom section of the test, it'll be, I think, a little more clear. So when you design your flour sack, think of it this way, right? So that it is a mass like this. You can argue or imagine it as the flour, and then these lines coming up, and they're totally straight. What you don't want to do is bow them out where they look relaxed. It won't look heavy, or the opposite, kind of bring them in so it looks more like a water drop or something. Either of these will not contain the same weight as this does. So just think of like as this mass, like I said, holding it down, and then two now very tight cords, if you want to call it, if you think of like a shopping bag here, pulling to what's holding it. Now the details I'll give it to make it feel like like I said, a flour sack is just this little bit of this other hanging corner here, like this, and then the little corner here. Now you can imagine this hanging on a pin or something. That doesn't matter. Don't overthink this. It's going to fall. It doesn't have to have a reason for falling. It's not about setting up something unwinding. Don't get into any of that. I really just want to see a very simple use of the fall. So it's just simply going to fall. And I'll add the little seam and corners here that gives a little bit of sense of overlap, depth, wraparound, and so forth. So now it looks like kind of a cartoony, and I should also mention there is this tradition of the flour sack in animation tests as well. If you have the illusion of life, you'll see a certain page of just different images of flour sacks acting. So yeah, there is a history of the flour sack. This is not in any way random. Okay, and then so once you have that drawing, then it's going to fall, hit the ground. So timing chart. So as I've said to many of you, hopefully all of you at this point in the crits, the dynamic idea, what makes the slow and slow out work, what makes the slow part and the fast part feel both slow and fast, is the relationship to one another, right? So with the ball bounces, it was the slow that made the fast active, and likewise the fast that made the slow active. It's still going to be the case here. So just both with this heavy object and also with the light object of the leaf, they both require a very clear distinction and a dynamic between your slow and the fast. Obviously, the fast is going to get kind of highlighted here or exaggerated, where on the leaf, the slow is what gets exaggerated. But they still need each other for it to work. So while you certainly will get very fast down here, when you think about the timing chart, right, you still need that one drawing just, and probably more than one drawing just right there. So if you first start it down here, if you start your first drawing here, no matter how fast you get down here, this will never seem fast enough. It'll just feel like it goes like that. There'll be no sense of weight. Really what you want is the feeling of acceleration, right? That's what you need to make visible in your animation for the slow in, slow out to work. And that's why we have to see the slow. So no matter how heavy the object, if we don't see the start of the slowness, we will never feel the acceleration or see the acceleration and therefore feel the weight, the fastness. They need both. And then at this point, it really is just a more accelerated, a more intense, a more intense acceleration rate. So, but that idea of, so something like this, right, is what we're looking for. The exact drawings doesn't count. Don't use this in any exactness. I'm just kind of making a more intense acceleration rate. And actually, looking at this a little further, I want to put that there, and maybe this one here. That feels a little bit better. And then why not put this one down here, right? So let's make this clear, the ones I intend. All right, but this is your slow. It's not as many drawings as the ball bounce, but it still has a nice slow, and then this will be your fast, and this is where it'll hit the ground, all right? And so forth. I'll draw that later. I want to talk about it further. So have that come down. Now, this is also something that I mentioned, I talked to a number of you about with ball bounces, is that so far we've been dealing with twos, right? Working in twos. And if you get too much spacing, if you try to get too fast, you get to what's called strobing. And that's where this kind of the illusion, that persistence of vision idea that your eye, we start to see an object continuously moving across the screen instead of a flashing bunch of drawings, that starts to break down if the spacing gets too much. And some of you with your ball bounces, if your fast was a little too fast, you start to get a little bit of strobing. In this case, because we have to go even faster than that, you'll have to do something else besides twos, and we're going to use ones. But also we're going to do something like that is we're going to have to push our stretch even further, really arguably even beyond the idea of what a stretch is, right? Into sort of more of what's like a smear. Although it's that is its own. The smear is kind of even a further part of this. I will sometimes call this an extreme stretch, but it is kind of basically a stretch entering the kind of concept of the smear. So as this falls, right, it is just the whole object will start to fall, but then this last airborne drawing, right, is going to really need to be moving fast, right? Let me just draw it over here because I'll overlap it. But what's going to happen is it's going to really be going. Now, one of the things when you talk about doing a stretch, right, especially a stretch on twos, it was very important that you kept your volumes consistent, right? Here, this is not going to be the case. We're not going to put this drawing on twos, this last airborne drawing. It's going to be on for one frame only. If you do not put it on for one frame only, you will never get fast enough, right? This will never feel properly heavy. And once something's on for just one frame, with that idea of, again, I said this to a number of you, with that kind of concept of a certain tradition of stretch and squash and stretch, being that you want to feel it but not see it, right? Once you're on ones, what gets seen entirely changes. So you can really start to blow out, push your shapes, etc. Because at one frame, we really won't see this drawing. We'll feel it, but we won't see it. We won't. If you increase your volume, you can go. It is possible to go too far, but just go too far, and I'll pull you back. But you can really start to increase your volume. Don't worry about it being exactly this, because we won't quite see it. You have a little more freedom, is ultimately what I'm trying to say here. But this drawing should really feel like it's moving. Really like letting it super long, and because of that speed, that one frameness, your exact spacing won't be exactly right here. Don't use the actual spacing of this. This is a bit compressed because of just the where I'm working, and I don't want these drawings to overlap too much. So this could actually get a little bit further down, and that's one thing, because that one frame, the idea of spacing being so exact, like we're really we focused on with the ball bounces, spacing being exactly what it is, this being different than that, is really kind of based on you're always working on twos, right? But once you start changing your timing, so in this one drawing, working on ones, and let me make this clear, every other drawing will be on twos, just this one drawing on one frame, then that changes the spacing relationships, right? So in this case, it's kind of a little simple, because one frame is half of two, so you can start to mentally imagine that it is whatever spacing you give it is doubled. But with this idea of one frame, it is going to go really fast, and with the elongating of it, you have a bit of a play exactly where it lands. So don't think you have to have your biggest spacing, like with the ball bounce. You don't have to have your biggest spacing between here and here. It can actually creep down a little bit because the one plays it. One thing for sure, though, you are absolutely not going to have a contact stretch. For those of you who played with the idea of contact stretch with your ball bounce, that idea of, you would have noticed, and this is like the important thing to know about contact stretches, is that when you put the contact stretch right, when you use one, it does slightly soften the actual landing, right? And with the ball bounce not being a heavy object, that's not a big deal. And then it shows, makes you feel the compression from going from squash to stretch on top of it, right? If you removed your squash, your contact stretch, you'll notice the ball bounce is a little slappier on the ground, and obviously a little less rubbery of a ball. But yeah, so you absolutely do not want to have this touching the ground, but you can actually get relatively close. And this becomes another aspect of smears, extreme stretches, that I want you to be aware of, right? Because what we're using it for, in part, is to prevent strobing. And what we're doing is, right, so if we had a Floursack here on one frame, let's say it was that size, you'd be going from this to this, and that would absolutely strobe. So this one frame idea of a smear brings the spacing way down, right? The object itself gets extremely elongated. And if you just Google animation smear drawings, you'll see some very ridiculous drawings. I think they're really fun to look at, but also what you want to realize is kind of how they don't have to look like anything, because ultimately they're not very seen, because they're generally for one frame. Also, and I'll say this to a number of you throughout the semester, because it's kind of my go-to, Eric Goldberg's animation of the genie in Aladdin. He did a ton of stuff with the genies over here on the screen, and zooms over here in like no time at all. Frame by frame that stuff, and you'll see some of the most ridiculous drawings, because they're more just they're being made not to make a decent looking drawing of the genie or whatever, but it's the arc of movement that's being articulated, and this kind of manipulation of spacing. So like if this ends up right here, right, then between frame to frame, you're only asking the eye to connect this object to this object, and that's doable. So one of the things you're doing by really elongated the ball here is the Floursack here, is that you're actually reducing the spacing between the objects, allowing the eye to see the movement through, to have that persistence of vision idea. Okay, so that's the dropping, right? So first start off getting a nice heavy feeling Floursack just by the drawing itself. Then you go into your slow end, you get super fast, and then it's going to hit the ground and do what's called follow through, right? And this is a very important aspect, like I said, of a principle of animation. And follow through applies itself quite a bit. In many ways, it's kind of sibling is drag, but these both drag and follow through are things you will always want to think about it with every movement you make in animation. They're just about as essential as the slow and slow out. Actually, if you talk to some animators, they're more essential. But drag, like I said earlier, is that idea that, and really what we start to do is we're starting to talk about a two-part object, right? Is that when, let's say in this case, my hand being the secondary object, when my forearm stops, the secondary object, my hand, still has energy that has to dissipate. So my forearm stops, this keeps going, and then finally comes back and settles. And that's follow through. And when I say drag, is it's sibling, because that's the opposite. When you start a motion, the secondary object goes into drag, right? And then when you stop a motion, it goes into follow through. Now this is something I don't want to get too far into with this assignment, because after these 2 assignments we're doing now, we'll be doing a drag assignment. But this is something like these could drag when it was a fall. They go from this kind of relaxed position as it's hanging on the pin. As it falls, it drags behind. If you want to bring that into your assignment, you can, but I'm not going to be looking for it. I'm really focused more on follow through and weight, but that's something you can think about. So you can see like the way I'm drawing these, you can say these little bits or details are now in drag position. But follow through. So what we're going to do, and this is crucial to the idea of weight, is to have the Floursack follow through. So when it hits the ground, right? So if you drop a pen, it would bounce off the ground a little bit. But the way we're going to conceive of the Floursack is having 2 parts with a bottom mass, right? And as I started here, and if you look at the way I'm drawing it, it's basically a squash ball, with exception a little more flat, right? So with the squash ball, the way you came off the corners was crucial in showing that the ball itself had some resistance, that it had energy still in it. Here I'm drooping this corner a little bit, and it's going to feel a little more planted. So what's going to happen is the bottom mass of the flower is going to just hit the ground and plant, where the secondary mass is going to do its follow through. I'll actually talk more about follow through over here. But when you're designing your Floursack, and I'll be drawing this, the settled version of the Floursack, when it hits the ground, you want to think of it as having 2 ball masses. And again, this goes back to what I was saying up here, that when it comes to kind of moving objects in space, it's really good to organize them as simple forms, so that when it rotates in space, you know how to draw it. So very basic, simple construction is how we'll do this. So I'm going to think of this as 2 ball forms, with a connected side stretching and a pinching side like that, and then I could add those little details, right? But really the main thing we're animating here is just these 2 little kind of ball forms, right? So structure your sack, your Floursack by that. So okay, so follow through. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you do what's called the keys first, and then we're going to in between it. So far, and really for the next few tests, before we really kind of get into the more and more complex stuff, we're doing what's called straight ahead animation. And straight ahead animation is when you do the first, like we've been doing, you do the first drawing first, and then you do the second, then you do the third. For very simple animation, or things that are essentially unpredictable, like fire, etc., in their movement, straight ahead animation is a good way to work. But as things get more complex, you want to do what's called key animation. So for the follow through section, this is how we're going to organize the key animation. And then you have key positions or extreme positions. So the keys you'll be using here first are the squash. So like I said, this bottom mass here plants itself. So that's going to stay still the whole time. So once you draw that, on the next drawings, you're basically just going to be copying it. The follow through is going to be performed by this secondary mass. So if this is the ground plane, obviously I have to draw these across. This will be staying still. The bounce will be going essentially vertical. There'll be ideally a little arc to it. But the squash drawing has the secondary mass the most compressed into the primary mass, right? And this can be quite low. Let me actually make it a little lower than my initial line. Like that. So this is your squash. And then of course it's going to bounce. Here, let me just kind of make these little. So here is the line, the height of the primary mass. This is the squash height. Hopefully I'm being horizontal here. So let me draw this. Like I said, when you're drawing this on your animation, you could just trace this drawing here. Don't copy and paste it, just trace it. Very important distinction for those doing digital. And then this is going to bounce up. All right. And you might want to just try to animate it as a simple ball. Don't get into this detail at first. Just it might make it a little easier, but this is going to get higher. So if this is this height, this bounces up to this height now. and then it's going to, so this is your apex, and then it's going to, of course, settle. Let me get the primary mass down again. And that'll essentially be somewhere in the middle. If this is the height of the squash, this is the height of the apex. It'll be kind of somewhere in the middle. Quite likely, there's some flexibility here, but quite likely favoring a little closer to the squash than it was the apex. And it settles like that. So do these 3 drawings first. And then you're going to want to play with the timing by adding drawings on what you need for this to have the proper spacing. So this is the follow through, right? So this obviously is this drawing. Once it hits the ground, it's immediately the squash drawing. And then this is where it has a ton of energy and you have to dissipate that. However, it's a little more complex because there's the possibility of a bounce, right? So this is the primary form, this bottom mass. This is the secondary one. This plants and this follows through, right? Squash, settle. Sorry, squash, apex, settle. You're going to have essentially 2 timing charts between these drawings. So this is kind of often when you see timing charts in actual animation, this is more how they're functioning, right? So that this drawing is the squash, this drawing down here is the apex, and then you have to decide how many drawings you want in between. This is what's called in-betweens. And then this drawing here, what this is referring to is, again, the apex, and then this is the settle. So here you want to decide. Now, many ways, so this is time going down, right? So obviously this is moving upwards, so they're a little bit in reverse. Hopefully that's not too confusing. But this is going to pop off of, you don't want to slow into this movement at all. You want to pop out of it. So it's really kind of a real super sharp pull out. There's the possibility of a cushion, right? Same thing as a slow out cushion into this. So there's a possibility you'll have a drawing down here, but the pop out of the squash, there'll be no drawings here. And then this is the apex, so it could ease in or slow in to a new movement here. So there's possibly drawings here, but in the settle, there certainly will be drawings. And I say possibly all the time throughout this because it's quite likely, and I would say maybe even most likely, you won't have any drawings between these 2 keys. You probably won't even have any drawings up here, but you'll definitely need to settle. Depends on your animation of it. Depends on the movement you designed in your keys, what will determine how many drawings you need. So quite often, you just need 1 or 2 drawings down here, right? And you're gonna really, so here this is a cushion into the settle, right? So just before favoring this drawing, and definitely not anywhere near that drawing. So that might do it. And what I recommend in this case is you're just getting used to this. And of course, like I said, depending on what your keys set up, you're gonna need to figure out what it needs in regards to in-betweens. So start by making that drawing, and then I would say if that's not enough, try another one here. Now, if you look the way I'm setting up the spacing, it's very important I'm not putting anything in the half, right? If you make a half as an extra, if you add a drawing, you're actually not creating in any way a slow in and slow out, because this and this makes both sides equal. Now, once you start putting another drawing here, these 2 are, this is halving. These 2 are still equal, but now it's like these 2 are slower than this, right? So often in kind of animation, you will see them having drawings, but the thing is they get so many different halved drawings that maybe the last 2 are always even spacing, but here you will start to get an effect of a slow out. Now that's a little bit of an aside, so don't worry about that too much, but I thought it should be kind of explained. But that's why we're not using a half. So if you really look at this, is maybe roughly a 2/3 down, and this is kind of 2/3 down, and that'll create a much more fast slow out. Now the option, I shouldn't say the optional, but maybe you'll need them drawings, or you might need one coming a cushion out of the apex, in other words, a slow in, and you might need a cushion prior to that into the apex, so in other words, kind of a slow out, right? Those are the big question marks. And even this one's possibly a question mark. So you'll need to play a bit to feel it out to what's the most kind of what makes us feel right, so the settle's appropriate. Make sure it doesn't pop. That's a very key thing. Um, and if you do just use one drawing, like I said, like, and even if you kind of just use a drawing, as soon as you're getting closer to the half, it will just kind of feel not like a cushion, but like a stop, and that won't work. But like I've said already now quite a few times, really depending on how you set up your keys is going to determine what you need in regards to in-betweens. Okay, that's the Floursack. Let's look at a couple Floursacks here so you can kind of get a sense of how these kind of work in motion. So of course, first off, this is actually quite a short test, as you can see. That first drawing is really important that you set it up as being already heavy. As I mentioned earlier, you do not need to get into why the Floursack falls, it just falls. The reason it falls is because you are an animation student doing a Floursack test. That's all we need. That first drawing really should be kind of feel heavy already, and then of course when it falls, it needs to, through its timing, also feel heavy. Right. So again, see, it's really fast as it falls, and then there's that idea of follow through at the end where the secondary mass does that little bounce, right, and then a settle with it. Let's look at this one frame by frame. So obviously, sure, start here with this drawing, and then just barely moves, just like the ball bounce. Here, at this moment, there's essentially little to no difference between the Floursack and the ball bounce. After this, we'll start to feel it, right? So now it's going much faster. There's that kind of extreme stretch slash smear I was talking about. Hits the ground with squash drawing. In this case, it pops up straight to its apex with an in-between, and then the settle. So right, so this had that two drawings of cushion into the settle. That's a pretty common result I see students do, so that's a good place to start. Remember, when you're thinking through the logic of this as it hits the ground, it has the most energy here. And you want this drawing to feel a bit compressed, right, with that secondary mass pushing into the primary mass, so that when it pops off, you feel the energy from that. And then you're into the settle. Now, there's a chance you'll need to cushion into the apex. That will be most likely. The bigger your secondary follow-through bounce, the more likely you become needing that cushion into the follow-through, and then possibly then a cushion out of the apex. Excuse me, I should have said earlier, a cushion into the apex, and then possibly a cushion out of the apex, and then it's going to be about the amount of settle you need here. If you look at this one, that's the next one I'm going to show you only has one drawing of in between of settle into its settle position. So notice how this one feels a little soft comparative to the other one. All right, let's look at the other one real quick. Same thing here. Have that drawing up top. Feels heavy, falls, hits the ground. You can see the follow through here feels a little sharper, right? When it's a little less soft. And we're only talking about one drawing's difference when it hits when it settles. This has a very similar structure to the previous, right? You start here. This one has a little bit faster of first spacing, but even this would be usable on a ball bounce, right? And it gets faster, really stretched here. Hits the squash. In this case, again, pops up to the apex. One drawing of in between, and then the actual settle. So that's the most common result I find with these tests, is that 1 to 2 drawings of cushion just going into the settle. But like I said, you might need a drawing easing out, slowing out of the apex, but also maybe slowing into the apex as well. Let's go back to the other one. One thing too I want to mention is there's a bit of an arc to the follow through. In this case, this one's kind of structured around the idea of a hinge, but it kind of goes, a little bit to the left and right. So don't let your bounce go just simply straight up and down. That doesn't look so good. And this one too, you see more clearly that this goes up to the right and then down to the right, making a little arc to the right in that bounce. But yeah, again, looking at how kind of cushioned this is. This is just a little softer at the end because it has that one extra drawing. All right, good luck.